Good morning. So on Tuesday, I was outlining a pair of lectures about responses to the Great War and what types of legacies that war had and what types of changes it caused or catalyzed. And the lecture on Tuesday basically outlined the cultural and political responses to the war, and try to detail what historians have described as an introspective turn to domestic life and the deep countryside in order to rebuild a sense of tranquility and stability in the country. That raised the big issue, really, for many people of what the war had been fought for, whether the war had been fought to return to a so-called Edwardian Golden Age or whether it had been fought to try and build a new type of society, to imagine some type of different prospective future. So what I'm going to do today is turn away from those sort of cultural and political responses to the war and look more at the economic consequences of the war and at the responses to those. And the key issue that we're going to explore in today's lecture is the degree to which the 1920s and the 1930s represented a definitive moment of turning away from the liberal political economy of the 19th century that, as you know now, because I repeat this in almost every lecture, was structured around the ideas of free trade, of cheap government, and the gold standard. And the issue we have to figure out today is what came to replace that, and how far Britain did indeed turn away from it, and what came to stand in its place. And basically what I'm going to be suggesting to you today is in the 1920s and the 1930s, you see the emergence of a new interest, indeed one might even say a new vogue for the idea of planning, and having an economy and a society based not around the freedom of the market, but of planned government intervention in both of those areas. So let me begin by talking about the economic chaos that followed the war. And I'm going to do this basically under three headings, which I'm just outlining to you here. First of all, I'm going to talk about the cost of war and its consequences on the attempt to try and re-establish liberal political economy. Then I'm going to talk about the domestic restructuring of the economy in the 1920s and 1930s, and then I'm going to outline the scale of unemployment and what I'm going to talk about as the rediscovery of poverty. So let's start with the costs of war. I told you on Tuesday that the war was hugely expensive financially for Britain, and that the national debt, which had been in decline since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, as you can see in this graph, took a decisive leap and rose from 706 million in 1914 to 7.4 million pounds. No, that's wrong. 7.4 billion pounds. And that continued indeed to grow during the 1920s and 1930s, and indeed, as you can see from this graph, reaches a, well, you can't because the dates aren't clear enough, but it reaches a peak in 1934. Now, Victorian liberal political economy had been based around the idea of sound finance and cheap government, of reducing the scale of national debt. And one of the first things that British governments do, and this is again a cross-party trend, one of the first things that the British government does is to try and reduce public expenditure. It's not so much of an issue in the immediate aftermath of the war, okay, with the standing down of the war economy that I outlined to you last night. But it becomes a particular issue with the beginning of an economic downturn in 1921, 1922. And it's then that there are real attempts to introduce new austerity measures, to retrench government expenditure. And that took the form of the so-called Geddes Acts on public expenditure. So the first thing that the British government does is to try and reduce the scale of national debt by reducing levels of public expenditure. Free trade, of course, completely disrupted by the First World War, is again immediately re-established in the aftermath of the war. Okay? It's very clear that the Treasury in the British government is determined to re-establish the British economy on its late Victorian and Edwardian footings in the aftermath of the war. And a key part of that was, as I said to you on Tuesday, the determination to return to the gold standard that had made the City of London the financial capital of the world and had facilitated Britain's facilitated Britain's overseas trade and the practice of free trade within a broadly protectionist international economy. However, these attempts to reinstall these three central pillars of cheap government, free trade, and the gold standard hit a series of crises. First of all, the reintroduction of the re-establishment of the gold standard creates a massive collapse in British export markets. Remember, they re-established the gold standard at its pre-war levels, and this makes British goods incredibly uncompetitive abroad. Suddenly they become 20 to 30% more expensive. This, of course, leads to pressure on wages by employers trying to keep their profit margins high. Okay? It's that downward pressure on wages that leads to a number of industrial actions by the trade union movement in the first half of the 1920s and culminates with the general strike of 1926, when pretty much 2 million unionized workers go out on strike. But the travails of the British economy weren't just British. They were also global in form, and that was very evident with the global financial crash of 1929. A crash that, of course, began in New York stock market, but came to have a calamitous effect on the world economy. The combination of these trends leads to the British government facing an enormous financial crisis in 1931. It's at that point that, so dramatic is this crisis, that a national government is formed which brings together the Labour Party, which had unluckily had its first majority government in 1929, just at the moment of this dramatic financial crisis, and primarily the Conservative Party. And as we'll see, one of the things that the national government sets out to do is to accelerate austerity measures. Now, the point that you need to get here is even though the so-called Great Depression of from 1929 is a global economic depression, it takes a very specific form in Britain, and it takes a very specific form because Britain is facing unique challenges. It's facing the unique challenge of its financial debt from the war. It's facing the unique challenge of having lost the comparative advantage of its early industrialization. And it was in a unique position because it still had the very considerable economic resource of the world's largest empire. Nonetheless, it's in 1931 that we can say that Britain basically leaves behind the central tenets of that liberal political economy. There may still be an insistence upon cheap government and getting government expenditure under control, but it's in 1931 that Britain finally abandons free trade and abandons the gold standard. So in 1931, a general tariff is introduced on manufactured goods, on the import of manufactured goods, with the exception of food, because remember Britain was dependent upon the imports of overseas food, certain key strategic raw materials, and most importantly of all, on all goods from the empire. In other words, what we see in 1931 looks not that dissimilar to the Chamberlainite policies of an imperial tariff system, of trying to make the British economy march in lockstep with an imperial, with the empire. So how then does the British economy restructure itself given these crises and these new challenges it faces? Well, the first part of this story is actually a holdover from the war. One of the ways in which British capitalists had got by during the First World War was by disinvesting from its foreign assets. Investment abroad contracted by about 20% during the course of the First World War, and that basically, that trend is reversed. But Britain never recaptures the same levels of overseas investment that had been so important to its late Victorian economy. The return to the gold standard, as you now know, led to a very dramatic collapse of its export markets. Not just the retreat from the gold standard, but also, of course, the scale of global depression. So you have here a graph of UK cotton exports, where you can see how dramatically in the 20s and 30s that drop-off is. The average value of exports falls on an index from 1920 to 1932 from 245 to 86, dramatically more than halved, although it recovers again by 1938, or it rises to the level of 100. There's also a collapse in the value of Britain's staple industries between 1920 and 1938, and I've just given you here the figures for coal and iron and steel. And the key point that you need to get here is that the nadir of the British economy, mapped here in terms of the value of staple industries, was basically in 1932, 1933. This is the low watermark of the British economy. Of course, the decline in this export economy means a dramatic drop of employment in these sectors. So, for instance, in 1924, the coal industry employs 1.25 million men. By 1938, there's just 782,000 coal miners left in Britain. So how does the British economy adapt to this significant decline of its export capacity? One way was by the development of new domestically orientated industries. And here there's a very nice synergy between the turn to new forms of domesticity in social and cultural life and the reorientation of the economy around domestic consumer durables. Again, very interestingly, many of these consumer durables produced in basically what we can think of as light engineering industry, which was electrically powered on the new national grid that was taking shape in the middle of the 1920s, enabled employers to hire women in unprecedented numbers to assemble these goods. Okay? So one of the things that happens in the 1920s and the 1930s is a very slow but significant shift away from the old male industrial worker that we associate with the staple industries and the rise of a new woman worker in light engineering. And women, of course, are still playing an important part in the industries they already had, like the textile industry. But women aren't just producing these goods. These goods are often also marketed for women. We're talking about things like irons, vacuum cleaners, toasters, tampons, cigarettes, a whole range of canned foods, all of these things. It's estimated that the size of women in these new industries rose to about 750,000 workers in the middle of the 1930s. And most of them were young, single women. Of women in the workforce in 1931, 70% of them were single, 77% of them were single, and 72% of them were aged between 15 and 34, which in my book still qualifies as young. It might not in yours, but 34 to me looks decisively youthful. The other point that I want to make about these is that these new industries are all located primarily in the south, in London, in the sort of main arterial corridors in and out of London, West London, that if you think of, if any of you have arrived in Heathrow, that journey that you take from Heathrow into central London is an absolutely key corridor for the development of these industries. Many of those old factories are along that road. And very, very few in the old industrial north. Now, I've been talking about the collapse of the export market, the development of this new domestically orientated economy around consumer goods. But there's also a continuing and indeed deepening importance of the empire to the British economy. Indeed, in many ways, the economy is structured around the empire in new and important ways in the 1930s. Given the system of imperial tariffs, exports to the empire rise, not surprisingly, in this I haven't got any dates up there. These dates are, I think, from 1924 to 1938. And one of the ways that this is consolidated is also in the government's very deliberate attempt to market imperial goods, both marketing British goods across the empire and marketing imperial goods in Britain. A great example of that was the creation in 1926 of the Empire Marketing Board, which produced a series of films and advertising that circulated widely in Britain and the empire, trying to educate British people about imperial goods. But also, this is important, the first Colonial Development Act in 1929. No surprise that the first Colonial Development Act happens in the aftermath of the crash of 1929. It's deliberately intended to try and develop colonial economies, not for their own good, but so that they can help the ailing British economy. The other key intertwining of the British economy with its imperial economy was the creation of the sterling area in 1931. When Britain left the gold standard, it tried to bolster the value of the pound by creating a financial currency system around the sterling, in which all members of the empire participated in, and indeed many other countries outside the empire, like Argentina, chose to be part of that sterling area because of the volume of trade they did with Britain. And I haven't got time to go into the rest. The point that I want to try and make, the point that I'm trying to make here is simply that the British economy becomes profoundly dependent upon the empire in new structural ways in the late 20s and early 1930s. Now, it's very important to say that this turn to the development of new domestic industries, the growing dependence upon an imperial economy, did not rescue the British economy. British economy was profoundly depressed through much of the 1920s and the 1930s. And the very best measure of that was, of course, the scale of unemployment. Now, it's not that unemployment had never existed before, but it is the case that unemployment figures hadn't existed before 1911. Until you have a system of national insurance and unemployment benefits, which was created in 1911, you have no official statistics for unemployment rates. So what we have is sort of guesstimates of the scale of unemployment before 1911. Demobilization after the war, basically the demobilization of 750,000 men from the British Army, the standing down of that war economy, both of these things had a dramatic effect on the rising ranks of the unemployed, which reached 2 million people by 1921. Throughout the interwar period, unemployment basically hovers between 10 and 25% of the workforce. That's between 1.5 million and 2.5 million. And it indeed peaks in 1932 at 3 million. And those figures are really, in some ways, just the tip of the iceberg, because unemployment figures excluded, the government's unemployment figures excluded those workers that were not under the National Insurance Scheme. Okay? So that was particularly the case, for instance, for women who didn't show up on unemployment rates. Unemployment was also very unevenly distributed in terms of its geography. It was clustered primarily not in the new booming southern economy, but in the old industrial areas. Okay, so, and this is what the map that I was trying to find before the beginning of the class, because I wanted to be able to show you this on a map. So think basically of South Wales, the industrial Midlands, the industrial Northwest, which stretches from Sheffield to Liverpool across to Leeds, the industrial Northeast, places like Newcastle, Gateshead, Sunderland, and the Clyde Valley in Scotland. Okay? These areas, and Belfast, I should add, sorry, in Northern Ireland. These areas become officially designated distressed areas in 1934. One of the things that the national government tries to do is to insist that unemployment is not a universal or general phenomenon. And so it tries to say, look, it happens primarily, it's not a general problem with the economy, it's just a problem in these very specific places, in these so-called distressed areas. And these distressed areas were given new grant schemes and such to try and facilitate the growth of employment. Now, this is where it begins to get a little complicated. Okay? Historians have argued for generations about whether things are good or bad in the 1920s and the 1930s, because we have this complex picture of, on the one hand, unprecedented levels of unemployment, and yet, on the other hand, we have a falling cost of living and areas of the economy that seem to be booming. The property market, the new industries, all of these salaried workers, government salaried workers, and so forth. So we have a disjunction between, on the one hand, the stagnation or decline of wages for the majority of the population, and a rising standard of living for the salaried middle classes, those people that were buying the Austin Sevens and taking out their mortgages and buying houses for the first time. But of course, there's no economy in the world that has mass unemployment that doesn't have a real downward pressure on wages. If you have a massive pool of surplus labor, no employer is going to voluntarily start paying workers more money, because there's a huge reservoir of cheaper workers able to take those jobs. So wages in the old industrial sectors particularly suffer greatly, and I'm going to focus upon the coal miners, because the mining industry is at the forefront of this collapse of the export market and the forefront of the industrial militancy of the 1920s and the 1930s. So a coal miner's wages between 1924 and 1935 fall from £180 a year to 149. And remember, the size of the workforce fell by about 500,000 during that same period. Now, in some ways, the poor and the unemployed are considerably better off in the 20s and 30s than they ever had been before, given that in 1921, national insurance is extended to 9 million new workers. There have been 2 million workers under the National Insurance Scheme before the war. There are 11 million workers on national insurance after the war. And they were given, in return, as a consequence of national insurance, 15 shillings for 15 weeks when they were out of work. Okay? And then after those 15 weeks, so they basically got 3 months of unemployment benefit. And then after that, there was an extended benefit for 47 weeks at a far less generous scale that kept on changing during the 20s and 1930s. But the combination of the expansion of national insurance and the massive rise in unemployment meant that the cost of social services, i.e. government expenditure on welfare, increased dramatically during this period. And you can see, and this is slightly unfair because I've given the first date as 1914, but between 1914 and 1938, it rises, government expenditure on social services rise from 101 to just under 600 million. As a consequence of this, the government is forever trying to shave off welfare payments, to reduce welfare payments. And so there's a huge debate, which we're going to see in context of the unemployed in a moment, of whether welfare measures was a right or whether it was part of a continuingly punitive attitude towards welfare payments that was a leftover from the culture of the workhouse and of the poor law. It's this issue that the national government in 1931 addresses head on when it creates a 10% cut in all welfare payments. And it introduces a hated measure, which was the introduction of the means test. The means test basically was a test to see how eligible you were for welfare, not on the strength of your individual wages, but on the strength of your collective family income. That is to say, a male breadwinner who loses his job wasn't simply given welfare in return for losing his job. He was now means tested to see how much his wife earned and how much his adult children would earn, who would still be living in his household, and his welfare payments was reduced accordingly. By 1930, 30% of the population were living under £3 a week. So a combination of unemployment, a combination of the reduction of welfare measures meant really widespread and considerable poverty. Now, in response to this, you have the emergence of a new type of political formation, which was an organization devoted to the protection of the unemployed and the articulation of the interests of the unemployed. And I should add, of course, that this is not unique to Britain. You see movements for the unemployed in the US in the 1930s and in Canada as well. You need this new organization, the National Unemployed Workers Movement, because the unemployed felt unrepresented by the organized labor movement. Trade unions didn't want to know you once you'd lost your job, and the Labour Party was the party of the trade union movement and had been instrumental in the austerity measures that were introduced as part of the national government, and had not been a friend to the unemployed, either in the 9 months in power in 1924 or in 1929. So this National Union of Unemployed Workers basically organizes a series of hunger marches, which had contingents which basically marched from all across the country, as you can see on this map. This is the hunger march against the means test in 1932. And they march and they all converge on London. They all try and converge on London at the same time. If you check out the website, you'll see the culmination of this hunger march in London with a Reuters news clip these hunger marches were basically completely ignored by most people. But they struck a nerve in 1936 in an unprecedented way. And part of the reason why that happened was because there was a non-partisan hunger march organized from Jarrow up here in the northeast. The big shipbuilding company in Jarrow basically closed, and unemployment in Jarrow reached around 80% after the close of the shipyard. And the town council, together with the local MP, who was Ellen Wilkinson, a Labour MP, organised this hunger march down to London. And it was the cross-party sense of this march that meant that people finally thought it was okay to feel sympathetic towards the unemployed. So I don't want you to think that everybody's concerned about the plight of the unemployed. They're not. But in the 1930s, people begin to recognize the scale of unemployment and begin to see it as not only a significant economic problem, but also a very serious social problem. And just as these unemployed workers march from the north down to the south, so increasingly intellectuals take the reverse journey. Suddenly intellectuals, people like writers like George Orwell, think that they have to go up to Wigan Pier and see what the north of England are like, and see what a strange country it is, and what its people are like. You see this also in J.B. Priestley's English Journal in 1934, where he tours around the country in his motor car, very like H.V. Morton had done in the countryside, except for rather than trying to find the ideal English village with its parish church and its village green, and its quaint locals, Priestley's concerned to try and provide an anatomy of Britain as a country, and outlines famously these three different versions. What are the three different versions of England? Have any of you done this reading? No? Anyone know the three versions of Priestley's England? The old rural England of quaint village greens and parish churches, the old industrial England, which he sees as haunted by the figure of the unemployed, and the new suburban England full of factory girls looking like actresses. It's not just figures like Orwell and Priestley, it's the documentary film movement, go and make films up in the industrial north to highlight the plight of the poor and the unemployed. New social research organizations do it. Everybody gets engaged with trying to grapple and educate people about the conditions of poverty in the industrial north. In this sense, I'm saying poverty and unemployment is rediscovered in the 1930s. I think I have time to do this. This is the clip of the... No, I don't have time. Okay, because I want to show you a clip from modern times instead. Okay, any questions before we get on to the planning stuff? Your love of economic history always overwhelms me. Okay, so out of this economic chaos comes a new interest in trying to find an alternative form of economic and social management. Where does that come from? Clearly, I'm suggesting it comes in part from the growing sense of economic and social problems, but it's also driven by other cultural forces. One of those is the increasing prevalence and visibility of science and technology, and the belief that science and technology will be able to transform the world is a form of unparalleled good, rather like our governor thinks that online education is the way of sorting out all the ills of higher education. There are certainly a wave of new inventions and the democratization of technology in the 1920s and 1930s, which is unparalleled. So you have the formation of the national grid in 1926. Something like 9 million households are part of that electric-powered world by 1938. You have the beginning of telephones. There are 1 million telephones by 1922. You have, of course, the wireless, or what you would know as the radio set. The BBC is formed in 1922. You have the introduction of talkies in cinema in 1928. And you have, as I say, all of these electrically powered goods that are filling up house. So this is a new everyday experience of technology in many people's lives that seems to usher in a brave new world. Now, science fiction is also a product in some ways of this time. As a genre, it goes back to H.G. Wells' Time Machine in 1895 and, of course, his famous War of the Worlds in 1898. But it really proliferates after the First World War. And it proliferates in a new type of dystopian view of this scientific future. And you see that very clearly in the reading in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World that you have online, but you also see it very clearly in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, which I'll just play you a very quick clip off if this works. Here we go.
Atelier 20, vitesse maximum.
Have you not seen that clip before? Great stuff. Chaplin was, of course, British, even though you Americans often like to claim him as your own. So Modern Times comes out in 1940, but it's a classic account of the sort of dehumanizing nature of mass technology and scientific management and production, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So there are those people who take this dystopian view of science and technology, but there are also increasing numbers of people who are entranced by the possibilities of science and science technology as a solution to economic and social problems. Key intellectuals like J.D. Bernal and Haldane in England advance a new type of scientific socialism, a belief that science in relationship to socialism can bring a new prosperity and happiness to human life. There are also those people who think that science provides a type of disinterested type of way of running the government, that science was above politics. You didn't have to bring socialism into science because science and technology provided an objective and disinterested way of reshaping government. And that strand is, I think, very important in the development of the idea of planning in the 1920s and 1930s. It also has its roots, of course, in American scientific management, in F.W. Taylor's famous book of 1911. But scientific management in Britain never really took hold for a variety of different reasons, one of which was the reluctance of British managers to think of management as a science. British industry was very much run by on a sort of gentlemanly amateur basis until remarkably late. Its influence was primarily felt during the First World War, and it was felt in a very different way, which is to say that a humanized version of scientific management was adopted. And the key figure here was the social investigator Seaborn Rowntree, who, through his work at the Ministry of Munitions in the First World War, was trying to provide those new forms of welfare to workers that would increase production that I told you about during that lecture. Out of that endeavor came the formation of these new units, the Industrial Fatigue Research Board in 1918, the Industrial Welfare Society in 1918, and then later the National Institute of Industrial Psychology. In Britain, in short, insofar as scientific management takes hold, it doesn't come in trying to dehumanize the worker. It takes hold through trying to take the human factor of production seriously, to try and provide forms of welfare that would make workers more effective. Now, one of the very marked trends in the 1920s and the 1930s is the growing influence that the social sciences have on the organization of government. And in many ways, you can see that in the proliferation of social research. You'll know from that lecture on the discovery of poverty in the late Victorian period that you heard remotely, that there were basically really a handful of big social surveys before the First World War. Okay? You could just about get to 5 if you're very expansive in your definition. Okay? After the war, there are 156 different types of social surveys conducted in just 17 years, between 1918 and 1935. And those social surveys weren't general studies of poverty like those before the war. They were now much more targeted. They were studies of housing, the problems with housing, problems with malnutrition and health, the problem of unemployment, etc., etc., etc. And all of them basically sought to expose the failures of a market-driven, laissez-faire approach to economic management. All of them also, in different ways, expose the failure of the parliamentary system and of parliamentary politics to deal with these issues. Okay, so it's a two-pronged critique. One, liberal political economy is a chaotic way of managing economic and social life. Two, that the political system is failing to deal with these significant economic and social challenges. Now, of course, one of the influences of all of this came from Soviet Russia and came from the 5-year plans that had been introduced there and to many on the left in Britain introduced very successfully. That Soviet Russia was one of the few significant economies to avoid the Great Depression, was taken by many people to be a sign of its very success. And so it isn't just people on the left that embrace planning. Not all of these social scientists and social investigators are on the left. And the best example of how broad this interest in planning was the formation of this organization of political and economic planning, an NGO called Political and Economic Planning, or PEP, in 1931. PEP came out of a weekend review, a journal called the Weekend Review, idea of a national plan. And it had people from across political parties, and from the business world as well as the political world. So Israel Sheaf, the director of Marks and Sparks, was one of its members. There were journalists like the editor of the Weekend Review, Gerald Barry. There were figures like Julian Huxley from the scientific world. Julian Huxley was one of the first founders of the World Wildlife Fund and a biological scientist. And political philanthropists like Leonard Elmhirst, who was the founder of a social experiment of a new type of school, an agricultural community in Devon at Dartington Hall. They all basically believed that scientific planning, the rational scientific organization of economic and social life, was a way out of the morass of these economic and social problems. Another key figure in all of this is someone who's going to become very important in the coming weeks, is the then director of the London School of Economics, William Beveridge. Beveridge had been David Lloyd George's protege. He had helped Lloyd George design the creation of the labour exchanges in 1910, 1911. He had been the man who had introduced the system of rationing during the First World War. Okay, so both great examples of active government organisation of economic and social life. And after the war, he became the director of the London School of Economics, which made its name as an institution not on shamelessly fleecing overseas students as it does today, but by trying to develop a science of public administration. The London School of Economics basically was the ground zero of social science in Britain, and the application of social science to public administration and to government life. One example, I'm going to now give you two examples of how planning takes practical shape. And the first is going to be around town planning, and the second is through economic life. So you already know that there was a massive development in the public housing stock in Britain in the 1920s and the 1930s. And that took place as a combination of public housing and the construction of private housing. Now, despite the ideals of the Garden City movement in the Edwardian period, that development of the housing stock in the 20s and 30s was completely unplanned. And it led to very fragmented estates being built. It led to the sprawl of suburban development across the countryside that so animated the Council for the Protection of Rural England, as we heard about on Tuesday. But it also created new estates that seemed to be cut off entirely from social life. They were built in places, for instance, that didn't have public transport services, or that didn't have pubs, or didn't have libraries, or didn't have any type of shopping facilities. And doctors become increasingly concerned in the 1920s and 30s with something that they call the neurosis of suburban housewives. That housewives cut off in these new domestic environments become increasingly neurotic because they've been separated from the social worlds in which they had grown up. It's also, incidentally, often on these new estates that the deepest pockets of poverty existed because people were so concerned to keep up with paying the rent, so they have the social prestige of living in these estates, that they cut corners on buying food and clothes and all the other necessaries of life. So, for instance, the Houghton estate in Liverpool housed 30,000 people in the late 1920s. It didn't have a single pub or a single shop. And really, in Liverpool, not having a single pub around 30,000 people is a significant problem. There are attempts to try and create, philanthropic attempts to try and create more planned forms of provision. So you see that, for instance, with the development of Wythenshawe near Manchester. By the way, this image of Bromley in Kent is meant to be an example of unplanned construction. John Simon was the architect, not the architect, but the person who basically led the push for the development of Wythenshawe. He was a Liberal MP, and he had a long-standing interest in slum clearances and housing development. In fact, he'd written a book in 1929 called How to Abolish the Slums. He was also an incredibly wealthy man, and he donated the land at Wythenshawe for the development of this new estate in 1924. It was at the time Europe's largest housing estate. Its population grew from 5,500 people in 1921, it was basically a glorified village, to 27,000 people in 1934. And it became a huge inspiration for the development of new schools of civic design and urban planning. Indeed, universities like Manchester and Liverpool and Birmingham, the new civic universities of the industrial cities, began to set up new departments of urban planning, very much like the one that we're in at this very moment. And a key figure there, the most influential figure of those academic circles, was a man called Patrick Abercrombie, who was a professor of town planning at the School of Civic Design at University of College London and in Liverpool. He went from Liverpool to London. Abercrombie was one of the members of the Council for the Protection of Rural England, and he's a big influence on the formation of this legislation for the restriction of ribbon development in 1935. He also goes on to plan many of the redevelopments of British cities after the Second World War. Yeah. Say that again, I'm not getting the question. Yeah, yeah. 30,000 people. Yeah. I know, you think, but no, I mean, there was no physical space for it because all they did was build tract housing. So there was actually, they used up all the space and then there was nothing available. And there was regulations about local council regulations and all the rest of it. No, you think someone would make a killing. Great idea. You need to go back to the future so you can pay off all your student loans. So let me finish up by talking about this very ugly man who you know to be John Maynard Keynes. It was clear to many people that, not just to Keynes, that the old liberal political economy was no longer good enough. But it was Keynes who basically provided the alternative vision, of a planned alternative vision to it. And of course, one of the things that so animated Keynes was the massive scale of unemployment. Unemployment for Keynes represented basically an economy that was out of equilibrium. Unemployment wasn't just a passing problem, it was structurally built into the management or the unmanagement of the economy. And he believed that basically that there was no effective way of dealing with that problem. You couldn't effectively, with the tools that the government had of the management of the money supply, use interest rates or the handling of wages to have a significant effect on the regulation of unemployment. And so instead what Keynes suggested is the development of a new type of demand management, where basically you would stimulate demand in the economy by creating new forms of employment on public infrastructure, and that this would be help levitate the economy out of depression. Okay, this ran completely counter to the austerity measures that had become so important to the philosophy of cheap government that continued to be held dear in the Treasury and in Whitehall. Now, Keynesian principles are never really adopted in England. You could say that the distressed areas, the designation of distressed areas and government investment in distressed areas were the closest that Britain came to it. And indeed, Keynes doesn't have a whole lot of political allies in Britain in the 1930s. His biggest supporter is probably Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, of which more on Tuesday, although the grand old man of Lloyd George continued to be deeply interested in his work. For Keynes, demand management was a way, and this is, I think, true of all of those people who embraced planning, or many of the people who embraced planning in the 1930s, it was a way of finding a middle path between capitalism and socialism. It was a way of trying to save capitalism from itself, bearing in mind that behind all of this is always the spectre of the Russian Revolution and the growth of the labor movement. The other key element of Keynes that I want to highlight for you today is that he's absolutely critical to this development of the idea of Britain having a new type of domestic economy. For Keynes, the empire wasn't enough to rescue the British economy. And indeed, he conceives of the British economy as quite separate from the broader empire. He's concerned with trying to conceive of that economy as a distinct national space with its own flows of trade, investment, and currency. And one of the things that happens that enables this new conception of a national economy to take shape in the 1920s and the 1930s is simply the acquisition of a lot more statistical information about the operation of the British economy. So, for instance, the First World War provides a catalyst for the collection of monthly statistics that index the scale of production. There had been no national measures of the scale of production in the British economy before that. And it took a 5-year census to see what the... thereafter there was a 5-year census taken to try and chart the rise and fall of production levels. This is the first time that production in the British economy is statistically mapped by the British government. The same is true of national income measures, which was actually collected a little before the First World War, but really get entrenched in the period after the First World War. It's astounding, really, that in 1939, only 10 countries, only 10 economies across the world had national income measures. It's not until the post-1950s that they really become generalized. And the other thing is, of course, shares of world trade, which again begin to be collected in the 1940s at the same time. So conceptually, okay, there is a new idea of the British economy and a way of how it can be transformed through economic planning and management, which required new levels of statistical information and detail in order for it to succeed. Okay, I can see that I've been talking for 1 hour and 5 minutes, which is ridiculous even by my standards. So let me wrap up. So, most importantly, what I've been trying to talk to you about today is what Keynes called the economic consequences of peace. That the war had a really dramatic effect on the structural conditions of the British economy. And that, taken together with a new recognition, a new cultural and political recognition of the effectiveness of planning, and a response to the contingent global events of the economy in 1929, begins to lead to this decisive shift away from the liberal political economy of the 19th century. But it's a slow and uneven and halting shift away. Okay? Britain reluctantly introduces protection in 1931. It reluctantly abandons the gold standard again. Okay? And effectively doesn't give up in the belief in cheap government right down to the outbreak of the Second World War. Nonetheless, there is an increasing sense of the utility of the social sciences and indeed of the social sciences in trying to think about how it is governments can take hold of the management of economic and social life. I've just given you a couple of examples, but I could multiply it across just about any area. The last thing that I want you to get from this is that Britain in the 1920s and the 1930s is a pretty schizophrenic place. It's a place where there are growing discrepancies between the experience in the South and in the North. Okay? And the North, I'm talking about, is less a geographical location than a conceptual one, which is to say, think of the North as all of the old areas of industrialization with London left out. Okay? It's South Wales, it's the Midlands, as well as the industrial areas of the Northwest and the Northeast and Scotland and Belfast. These areas which have been the backbone of industrialization during the 19th century, which had been at the forefront of the idea of Britain as a maker of the modern world, become, in the 1930s, to be seen as something of a relic, a remnant. It's no longer that they're no longer the places that generate wealth and prosperity. That is now orientating to new industries and to new areas in the South. And mapped onto that separation was a separation of class, of the working classes, of the old industrial working classes, and a new salaried middle class and bourgeoisie who were embracing their new electrically powered, mortgage-owning, car-driving future. Okay? And on that lovely upbeat note, we'll leave it until next week. Thank you for enduring with me today. That was a